In the last couple of days, I've uploaded a couple of videos about using a Nellie B weaving loom to make woven squares. And I want to show you something that might help if you're going to chain stitch yarn to make it thicker before using the Nellie B loom to weave. This is a square that I had woven with my favorite wool, which is fisherman wool worsted weight yarn. But it is a light worsted, and it's not as tightly twisted as other wools. And after washing, it did not felt. I know it's difficult to see how that is in texture, but because it's so light. But it's not quite, it's a beautiful square. And for a light shawl or a baby blanket or even, I guess, a light sweater, it would be wonderful. Now here's another thing that happened on the vintage wooden loom. I got slightly more of a rectangle going this way, top to bottom, instead of a square. Can you see how that's just a little bit more rectangular than a square? On the metal frame loom by Nellie B, they always come out a square. So I don't know why that is. One was issued earlier, the wooden one is earlier than the metal one. But you might want to keep that in mind, because when I was thinking it's narrower this way, and when I go to sew it to the next square, I'm going to end up with a more rectangular look. Now, I wanted a square, so I'll probably use the metal loom more than the wooden one. But there's the fabric, and so I decided for what I want to do, it's not thick enough. And in one of my videos, I had shown different methods of making yarn thicker before you weave it. And what I've done is measure out. It's more than 55 yards, and it's more than a half an ounce. It's about an ounce, and I didn't use a yardstick to measure it. I was just kind of guessing. So, but it takes 55 yards of worsted weight yarn, which is then chain stitched with a crochet hook to make 16 yards of yarn to use in the Nellie B loom. So what I'm doing is chaining a little more than 55 yards so that I can weave a square with that and see how thick that comes out. Now, what I'm doing is just sitting here chaining, and you know, it's a little monotonous, especially if I'm going to be doing this with all my yarns. But at the same time, this reminds me of Knitting Nancy's. In the sense where, and I actually used to crochet like that, about 25 or 30 years ago, where I would keep a crochet hook in my back pocket, and I would always have something I was crocheting. And of course, when I was younger, it was Knitting Nancy's, and then in recent years, it's been Knitting Nancy's. So this I'm familiar with, and for me, it's relaxing actually. But it can get monotonous. So what I've done is set up like a little station here at one end of the table. And the hint that I want to give you is this is my Laces Yarn Ball Winder 2 that I've been using, and I have to say, I don't know how I lived without this before I had it. You know, I've been using yarns and fibers for 25 years or more. I never had a ball winder. I did have a Nostipend, which is just a wooden stick ball winder, but I ended up just rolling everything up in balls. And now that I have this, it's wonderful. And it's not only for winding yarn from a skein to a ball. I'm sitting here chaining, and all because I'm doing this much yarn, it's only an ounce, but it's a lot of yarn. It was all over the floor. It was going to get tangled. it's going to be a lot of yarn. So what I did was, as soon as I had like a foot chained, I attached it to the yarn ball winder. And what you do is just, okay, I think I can take it out of here. You take your yarn, I think that's showing up, and if you hold it above the guide loop and go right under it once, like that, and then bring the yarn forward and go under the longer stem that's there, then you're through the guide loop. And you just start winding after putting the end in the slots on the top here. So I'm finding that as I chain, I can just wind it right on to the ball winder. And then I can walk away from this, come back to it later. But the real advantage is, when I'm done chaining and winding, I will have somewhere around 16 yards of chained yarn to go ahead and make a square. So it's a little bit more convenient than keeping the ball in your pocket and you know, having this long strand of chained yarn follow you around. So that is what I'm doing, and when I get that done, I will know exactly the difference between chaining the yarn first or just using it as it comes off, you know, from the factory. You know, it is a beautiful square, and it fluffed up more than I thought it was going to, and it's thicker than I thought it was going to be. It's still beautiful wool. It's just not as thick as I want it. So that is what I'm doing, and the yarn ball winder, I got this one at Amazon. It was about $26, and well worth the money. Really well worth the money if you work with yarns all the time. Now, the other two methods that I had shown for making the yarn thicker were using a Knitting Nancy to make strands and using a Lucite to make lucided cord. I know for a fact that the lucided cord will also wind on the yarn ball winder the same way the crocheted chain is. And this should too, because this is the Knitting Nancy strands. I don't have them long enough right now, but I was thinking if I take, here are the Lion Brand bonbons. These are 22 yards. They're not enough to make a square on the Nellie B loom, but it's 22 yards. If I use this in a Knitting Nancy, I can either, depending on how long they are, tie them with a pipe cleaner just to keep them separate, or if I'm doing, you know, like if I bought a skein of Lion Brand woolies, and which is 187 yards, and knit the whole thing on a Knitting Nancy, I could easily wind that onto the ball winder. The guide loop on the ball winder, I've been able to get super bulky yarn through it without a problem, and that's about what a knitted strand would be. This would compress as it goes through. I know that'll go through. So you could do the same thing that I'm doing with the yarn ball winder, with the Knitting Nancy strands and with lucided cord. And I probably will be doing just that with all three of these methods for making yarn thicker before I weave it.